Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Hello, I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm the president of Bay Area Skeptics. Thank you for joining us tonight for the July Skep Talk. I'm very happy to be introducing my friend Mark Baslow tonight, but a very odd thing happened this morning. I picked up the San Francisco Chronicle, pulled up the comic page, which part everybody reads, of course, in the newspaper first thing. And the comic strip Canterville had a most unusual cartoon. Clyde says to Lamont, what you say life is? And Lamont says, a parade of air-bursting bolides. And then look at the second panel. When an extremely bright meteor hurtles toward Earth, it's a bolide. If it blows up when it enters our atmosphere instead of impacting the surface, that's an airburst. And the rest of it is all about what happens when you eat old burritos. But I want you to concentrate on that second panel here. Our speaker tonight is known in the scientific community as an expert on airbursts. Coincidence? I think so. We're skeptics, but we don't get excited about things like that. But it was kind of fun, and I thought I'd share the cartoon with you anyway. Mark's professional work does indeed focus on airburst modeling and understanding the risk of near-Earth objects. Mark was, I think, the first scientist on the scene when the Chelyabinsk, I don't pronounce Russian very well at all, so cut me some slack on that one. Wait till I get to Tunguska. But when the Chelyabinsk meteor became an airburst in 2013, and he has also made contributions to our understanding of the Tunguska event, which was another airburst. Mark received his PhD in applied physics from the California Institute of Technology and worked from 1983 to 2017 when he retired from Sandia National Laboratories. Currently, he divides his time between the University of New Mexico and Los Alamos National Laboratories, where he continues his work on NEOs and their risks. The very fancy slide here is a graphic from his work at Sandia when his team was modeling the Tunguska airburst, which produced quite a fireball. That's a very wonderful picture that I found on the internet, so I'm going to inflict it upon you, Mark. You've probably seen it before. But actually, we didn't invite Mark here to talk about his actual scientific work. Sometimes we do that, but we invited him to talk about his work with scientific skepticism and science advocacy. The website for International Asteroid Day event, for which Mark is chair of the experts panel, described him as, and I quote, a proponent of scientific skepticism. Dr. Baslow is a vocal critic of pseudoscience and anti-science, such as climate change denial. Sounds like our kind of guy. You may have seen him at SciCon. There's a picture of that conference, or heard him on CSI's Point of Inquiry, or read his articles in Skeptical Inquirer. He's a scientist who has taken seriously the important task of communicating science to the public accurately and clearly. for which I thank him, and we wish there were more like him. If you're watching a documentary on NEOs, you're very likely to run into Mark. He was elected a fellow of CSI in 2011. Now, I would surely be remiss if I didn't mention my friends at New Mexicans for Science and Reason, which is Mark's home skeptics group. They're the Bay Area Skeptics for New Mexico, a fine group of people. Check nmsr.org. They've done a lot of quite fun things on April 1st, for example. And I'm sure that our guest tonight would readily confess to being part of some of the April 1st hoaxes that NMSR has put out. As befits someone who studies asteroids and their potential devastation, Mark has an asteroid named after him. And I just wanted to say, given his professional line of work, 72530 Baslow fortunately is not aimed at us. All right, tilting at strawmen and other tricks of climate denial enablers, Mark, welcome to Bay Area Skeptics. I didn't know we were going to be wearing matching red, but I guess we can be color coordinated. What the heck?
Thank you so much for the wonderful invitation, Jeannie. And I've admired your work with NCSE and Bay Area Skeptics for a long time. I know that when we formed New Mexicans for Science and Reason, I think a lot of the inspiration came from Bay Area Skeptics, and I'm really happy to be proud to be part of NMSR, along with Ken Fraser, Dave Thomas, and others. So thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the cartoon reference, and I will be talking a little bit about cartoons. In fact, I wore there we go. I'm delayed, so I'm looking at myself on the video, but the moods of Cranky Uncle, and that's also a plug for John Cook, who will be here next month.
You bet. All right, Mark, take it away.
Okay, so thank you. It's great to be here. So my presentation, Tilting at Strawmen and Other Tricks of Climate Denial Enablers, came out of my criticism of the recent book, Unsettled, by Stephen Kunin. So I wrote a review of that. I actually originally was intending to write that for NCSE reports, and Glenn Branch got a review copy sent to me, and I wrote it up, and then found out that NCSE reports was booked up until January or so, and I kind of wanted to get it out sooner. So it ended up in Yale Climate Connections, and it got out really fast. It was one of the first published reviews. So, but I am, since I am criticizing someone, I like to put up a disclaimer when I do that. So I want to make sure people understand this is not so much a scientific presentation. It's a criticism of denialist tactics. I don't like to attack people. That is ad hominem, and that's kind of against both the rules of decorum and the rules of logic, which we'll talk about. But criticizing behavior is legitimate, and that's what I'm going to try to focus on. Now that said, patterns of behavior may be an indicator of reliability, integrity, and so forth, but I want people to draw their own conclusions. And then that said, the opinions expressed here are my own, not necessarily those of my employers. So here's my motivation. The book came out a couple months ago, and I wanted to see where my review came in a Google search of the words unsettled included, the name of the book and the name of the author. And I used Google from my own Chrome browser, and my review came in very high. And so I thought, I'm going to use Opera, and I'm going to use VPN and pretend like I'm coming in like an anonymous person from Amsterdam. And my review still came in number 4. So it's clear that people have seen it. The author has probably seen it. And so it's gotten quite a bit of attention. So I'm going to use, as a user, and I don't want to take any thunder away from John Cook, who created Cranky Uncle and was the founder of Skeptical Science. He's going to be presenting in a month. But it's almost like I feel like I'm a software user and he's a software developer. He developed led the development of this taxonomy of methods that enablers of climate denial and climate denialism use, and he used this sticky acronym FLICC, F-L-I-C-C. And I won't go through the details of this because I'm assuming that John will next month. But I used it extensively when I reviewed Kunin's book. So there's fake experts, there are logical fallacies, and we all know about logical fallacies. But there are other things that aren't necessarily logical fallacies, but maybe, exploiting ignorance or biases or gullibility and so forth. So one thing I like about this is the little cartoon logos in each of these. It makes it very easy to remember them and in fact to use them. And I'll show you how I did that. So here's a few examples. And the title of my talk is Tilting at Strawmen, because that's one that was used very extensively by the author of Unsettled. So John goes through, and every one of these, he has a definition and an example. So here's the definition of strawman: misrepresenting or exaggerating an opponent's position to make it easier to attack. Example, in the 1970s, climate scientists were predicting an ice age. So something that scientists really weren't predicting, it's not really what people were saying. But if you convince people that's what they were saying and then attack it and say, well, see, they were wrong, it makes it a lot easier to make your case. And to the non-expert, how do they know? So there's ad hominem, which I mentioned in my first slide. So there's a logical fallacy associated with that. Just because someone, may have some flaw or perceived flaw doesn't make them wrong about things. So that's the logical fallacy. But on top of that, it makes you look bad to attack somebody, to make it look like a personal attack. And we don't want to do that. I'll go into a little bit of that later. There's magnified minority. There's impossible expectations. And I won't go through and read all of these, but there are a lot of them. These are just a few examples. So anyway, back to this. It's really a guide to criticism that I try to use. So here's a nice set of those logos, and if you want to memorize them, you can go back and forth. I kind of like. Some of them are obvious, like the cherry picking at the top. The one next to it is conspiracy theorism. It shows some guy wearing a foil hat, it looks like. So there's kind of a mnemonic way of remembering them. The red herring's pretty obvious. The straw man is pretty obvious, and so forth. And I think John might be watching. What I'd really like is to have stickers. So you know how teachers grade papers and they put stickers on the paper? I'd like to be able to have a sheet of these things that I can peel off and stick in books and other things that I'm reading or reviewing, so I can keep track of where the logical fallacies are and where the other tricks are. And it would have been really useful for my review of Unsettled. So there's another guide to criticism, and I just called it the CSI Guide to Criticism because it was published by Skeptical Inquirer. Ray Hyman, along with Carl Sagan and James Randi and others, was a founder of what was then called PsyCop. And he wrote this up, and it was first published on the 25th anniversary, which turns out to be, now we're at the 20th anniversary of this publication. It was 20 years ago this month. And so it's a little bit different than the guide for criticism that John Cook prepared. So John was very methodical. His method is really how to identify problems, and Ray Hyman's had more to do with, being prepared, how does it make you look? So in a way, you know, John provides the tool, and Ray kind of provides the how to use the tool. So here's a couple of them that I kind of like and try to use, and these are sometimes hard for us to use. Like, for example, the principle of charity. You don't want to make an assumption about somebody's motivation. One, you know, you really can't do that without evidence. And two, it kind of makes you look bad. And we want to be the good guys. Also, using loaded words and sensationalism, you know, that's something that the other side does. That's not something we should be doing. So now I want to kind of criticize the critic, because Stephen Kunin, the author of the book that I'm criticizing, is widely known as a critic of other things. Now, I know Steve Kunin. I took a class from him when I was a graduate student at Caltech. I took his quantum mechanics class. And so years later, a decade after I took his class, I was working at Sandia, and cold fusion became a thing. My office mate at the time was an electrochemist, and he thought it was BS. I was a physicist. Most of the people I knew were physicists. We all thought it was BS. So when Steve Kunin got up at the APS conference in 1989 and said, you know, that it seems like pawns in flash, and his conclusion is that they are incompetent and perhaps deluded. This is from a YouTube video, and this was a slide. This was the olden days when we used to handwrite things and use overhead projectors. So he actually had those written down, incompetent or deluded. That is an ad hominem attack. That's not appropriate. It's interesting, the reaction. You can Google and find this YouTube video. There was a lot of nervous laughter at first, and then, you know, people started clapping. It's like, well, he said it, so, and we all agree, so they all clapped. But it, I think, made a lot of people nervous. Now, me having been a student of his, I kind of agreed with him, and I was, you know, it's like, wow, my professor, you know, really made a statement there. So that is I'm using John's logos here. The one in the lower right-hand corner that I just put up is the ad hominem, and I think it's a gun sight. It looks like a gun sight. So in this case, so I've got a copy of Unsettled here, and if you know, look at the first page, and then there's a flap, like there often is on these things, with a blurb. And so this is part of the cover. And, you know, the first thing I did was I looked at the blurb on the cover, and, you know, I was a little unsettled by what the cover said, and I felt like I could judge the book by its cover. And let me tell you why. So if you look at these three examples, surging sea levels are inundating the coast, hurricanes and tornadoes are becoming fiercer and more frequent, climate change will be an economic disaster. Well, that does sound like something, you know, that people have said and that you might want to criticize. He goes on to say, you've heard this all presented as fact, but according to the science, all these statements are profoundly misleading. So in starting my review, I do what I often do, is I Google things to figure out where they came from. Surging sea levels are inundating the coast. Well, who exactly said that? I mean, normally scientists don't say things like that. There's a lot of caveats. I would expect somebody to say, if the West Antarctic ice sheet collapses, or Greenland collapses, the ice sheet, or if there's a major storm surge with sea level rise at high tide, that'll inundate the coast. There's a lot, you know, there's just a lot of caveats and careful verbiage that normally goes with this. So who said that? Maybe it was a reporter. You know, maybe it was, you know, a TV commentator. I don't know. So I Googled it, and I Googled it for the 40-year period but prior to the year that he wrote the book, or the year before the book came out. So here's what I Googled in quotes, and here's what I got. There weren't any returns. So it didn't find that quote anywhere. So it hadn't been said. or at least Google didn't know where it had been said, and I don't know where the author had read that. So I expanded my Google search. Here I'm Googling again, but I don't put dates. You don't, normally when you Google, you're Googling for whatever information Google has, but I put in that filter in my first search. So here's the second search. All of a sudden there's over 2,000 results. And the first one is Unsettled by Steve Kunin. So then I put in the quote plus Kunin's name to see how many of those were attributable to him, and only 200 less were, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't create the quote. That just means that whatever Google found didn't necessarily include his name. So that sort of implies that that's a straw man. Same thing with hurricanes and tornadoes are becoming fiercer and more frequent. I Googled that with that filter over the 20-year or 40-year period before he wrote his book. No matches. Now, suddenly, there's over 2,000, and fewer than 100 less are associated with Kunin himself, the author himself. So let's see what happens with climate change will be an economic disaster. Here we go. Here's our filtered search. And sure enough, actually, somebody did say that. But it looks like if you look at the top 3 hits, they all have the same date, October 26, 2015. So basically, they're all quoting the same thing. And what was that? It was an LA Times column on that date. And it has a lot more results than the other quotes did. So apparently, a lot more people have read this column or quoted this column than have read the book Unsettled. So I clicked on the column and went to the column, and here's the title of it: Climate Change. It's right there in the title. Climate change will be an economic disaster. But you'll notice that it's not a news story. It's a column. It's an opinion piece by a business columnist, not by a scientist or a science reporter or even a science columnist, by a business columnist. And so I was curious, well, how many times and in what context does he say in the column that it will be a disaster? And so I searched the PDF file for the word disaster, and it only shows up once, and it's in the title. So he didn't even say it in the text. And as most of us who are familiar with the media know, headlines tend not to be written by the reporter, and column headlines, it depends on where it's published. So he may have written this, but it's very likely that had been written by an editor. So it's not clear to me that the word disaster ever appeared in this other than in the headline. Not written by a scientist, but by a business columnist. But if you look down at the bottom, there's a link to the actual paper. It's a paper from UC Berkeley and Stanford with authors from those institutions. And so you can click on that. It was published in Nature, and there it is. So I did the same thing. I did a document search on the word disaster. They never said disaster in the entire thing. And not only that, they're not scientists, they're economists. So they're scientifically literate economists, but nevertheless, they're economists, not scientists. So again, that's not, being presented as fact. It's based perhaps on one headline for one business columnist's opinion piece. So then the next thing in there is the science is settled. We've all heard it. The authors or whoever wrote the blurb. I'm not sure the author wrote the blurb, but it was definitely used by the publisher to promote the book. When it comes to climate change, the media, politicians, and other prominent voices have declared the science is settled. So let's see who said that. Where did that come from? I've heard that many times. I've always kind of wondered. So let's look at that. So I narrowed my dates from 1985 to 2000 to try to find the first instance. And here's the return on my search, 1996. It doesn't appear to show up before 1996. And if you look at it, well, the first one is Friends of Science, which is an oxymoronic name for a group that are not friendly to science or scientists. It says June 12th, but if you drill down, actually Google sometimes makes errors, and it wasn't actually used until July 11th, 1996, a letter to the Wall Street Journal by Fred Seitz, along with another letter by Fred Singer. And as probably most of the people here know, they are on Naomi Oreskes' list of the merchants of doubt. They are the ones who basically created the playbook for climate denial. So it's funny, you also, on the second one, it's Steve Schneider's name shows up, the strong pro-science, pro-climate science spokesman from Stanford, who sadly passed away several years ago, but a giant of the field, and he still has an archive, so it shows up in his archive. So it's easy to find and download. So here, you know, I Googled again, because sometimes the little Google little capsules underneath the returns kind of do a better job than I would at summarizing what it actually said. And it was actually during a time where there were attacks on Ben Santer, another Bay Area scientist from Lawrence Livermore, who is now actually has decided to leave Livermore. This was in the news a month or two ago, and it was because of Steve Kunin's position on a committee and invitation to speak at Livermore. So there was a very strong and personal attack on Santer, led by Seitz and Singer, and they used the Wall Street Journal. So if you look at the second one, it says Wall Street letter by journal by Seitz, but Google grabbed the headline, and this is actually part of it that Singer wrote, the second letter that Singer wrote, and it says, when basically it said the parties are anxious to stipulate that the science is settled. That's where the term science is settled came from. It came from Fred Singer. So here is my analysis using my virtual stickers that I grabbed off of John Cook's virtual sticker sheet. So that's a straw man. That's a straw man, completely fabricated. That's a misrepresentation. It was said by somebody, but it was said by either a columnist or a headline writer. And that's another straw man, or it could be a misrepresentation. A straw man is a subset of misrepresentation if you look at John Cook's taxonomy. So now we're probably almost halfway through my talk, but we're only on page 1. And so I didn't have stickers. All I had was a pencil when I started to review this book. And he starts off, the author starts off the introduction defining the science with capital letters in quotes, as if the science, according to us, the supporters of the consensus, is something that we've defined that you somehow cannot criticize, which is not true. So, you know, I saw that he kept repeating that, the science in quotes with capitals, over and over. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to count them. And I put it in squares because I was already counting the science is settled and putting my number in a circle. And he began to say it over and over. And so what is that? Well, that's also a straw man. And if you look down, I'm putting little notes, straw man, cherry picking. And so it's easier to put little stickers. So I'm anxious to get a sticker sheet. There's the cherry picking. So I want to say something about magnified minority. I'm up to page 3 now, and I'm just kind of hitting some of the high points because I can't be exhaustive. So Kunin says in January 2014, I convened a workshop with a specific objective to stress test the state of climate science with 6 leading climate experts. So this was a part of the American Physical Society, which is one of my professional organizations. And in fact, I've served on the executive committee of their topical group on the physics of climate. And so they were looking at APS's, the overall society's position statement, and he convened this group, and he recruited 6 climate experts. He recruited 3 consensus climate scientists listed here. I already mentioned Ben Santer from Livermore, and 3 non-consensus climate scientists, 3 who to various degrees reject the consensus and are very vocal about it. And you see them a lot on television and in blogs, and they get a lot of invitations and so forth. But we know there's a 97% consensus. 97% of climate scientists and experts in the field accept the consensus, and that was several years ago. I'm convinced it's significantly higher than that now. So, you know, if you picked 6 at random out of 100, but 97 are consensus scientists, how many non-consensus scientists would you expect to get in that diverse group of scientists? Because scientists don't all think alike. We have our disagreements. We just don't have that many disagreements about the scientific consensus on climate change. So, so that is magnified minority, and the little logo shows what one person being magnified over the size of the other. So it's a little easy, a little nice little mnemonic. So this comes from John Cook's book, The Cranky Uncle. And so it's just a visual illustration, and I like it a lot. And one thing I like about it, it reminds me of those little puzzles I used to do when I was a kid. You know, it's like, which ones are different? Well, it looks like they're all raising their hands. Find the ones that aren't raising their hands. They have these in the back of the paper sometimes, things like this. So I don't want to sit here and make you stare at it until you find it. So I'm just gonna circle them. There's one, and you know, that looks like it could be Richard Lindzen. I don't know. There's one that looks like it could be John Christie, or it could be Ned Flanders. I don't know. And there's one. I don't know who that is. But anyway, those are the 3 figuratively that Kunin chose to be. And then he chose 3 of the people with their hands up. Magnified minority. So here's now we're already up to page 15. This is a kind of a fallacy rich paragraph, which is why I chose it. And I'll let you read that and think about which fallacies and which tactics you think apply to this. And then I'll put up what I think, and I'll be interested in hearing what John Cook thinks as well. But this is just, you know, with my limited experience using John's taxonomy, I'll show you what my effort was. So here's the list that I came up with. I'd call that a misrepresentation. Calling for open scientific discussion. That's not what deniers do. Deniers don't tend to publish in the peer-reviewed literature. They don't come to our scientific meetings. They don't behave in a collegial way. That's not typically what they do. That's not who most of us refer to when we use the term climate denier. Okay, here's a red herring. This is a real doozy. Bringing up Holocaust denial in the context of using the word climate denial. They're totally different things. We're using the same word, denial, but I'm going to get to the definition of the word denial later. But to start bringing up Nazis and having had your relatives murdered in Eastern Europe kind of seems to be getting off track. That's a distraction. Persecuted victims. Well, less serious critics will attack me personally. You know, I'd have to say to the author, welcome to the club. If you look, you know, if you talk to Ben Santer or Mike Mann or Catherine Hayhoe or Steve Schneider, if he was still around, they were viciously attacked. They've had death threats. They've been vilified. They've been called liars. They've been, you know, libelous and slanderous, everything. So I don't think he should be, he's not going to get to that level. I guarantee it. That's not going to happen. Quote mining. Well, climate denier is an obvious case of that. Many of us use that term. It's shorthand. It's a convenient term, and it's descriptive of what we're talking about. But when you take it and use it out of context, it sounds like it's an insult, but it's a descriptive term. And then I'd have to say the whole thing is a straw man. There's so many tactics packed into that one paragraph that I put a box around the whole thing. So let's talk about climate denial. The term climate denial. It's not a Holocaust reference. It's not. I don't know anybody who, when they use it, intends it to be a reference to the Holocaust. So I dug out my my old Ninth New Collegiate Dictionary, which was published in 1983, and it has a definition which I show, and the whole thing. And you see it in parentheses, it says 15C. Well, for those of you who actually still use dictionary books, you probably know what that means. It's been used in that sense since the 15th century. The Holocaust didn't happen until the 1940s. It means literally one that denies. The example they give is deniers of the truth. But you can also be a denier of Christ or a denier of Jesus or a Holocaust denier. You can use that word to refer to anything that you're in denial of. And it's interesting, I tried to think of, well, who used this and what did they use it for in the past? Well, obviously, and it may have been intended to be a slur. It may have been intended to just be descriptive of non-Christians. I don't know what the blue line means, but it was widely used in the 19th century in that sense. And one thing that kind of surprised me was the term Holocaust denier. I would have expected that the use would have probably started going up in the 1950s, maybe, but it didn't. It didn't start going up until the mid 1980s. And in fact, it hadn't been used in that sense when my Ninth Collegiate Dictionary was published. That wasn't even what it was being used to describe. So I used this Google Books Ngram Viewer just to compare Holocaust denier to climate denier versus climate skeptic, and I spelled it both ways, just so you can see, when they came into use relative to one another. So, the Holocaust denier term didn't come into use until, something like over 40 years after we learned about the Holocaust. And climate skeptic, climate denier, neither one of them came into use, until, depending on when whether you use the first IPCC report or whether you use the 1950s Gilbert Plass, we kind of gradually began to understand more and more about the human causes of global warming, but nevertheless, the delay isn't that much different. So it's hard to argue that it's a reference or any kind of intentional effort to invoke the Holocaust. But now, okay, I became interested in, well, who created this meme? Where did this come from? We can attribute the science is settled to Fred Singer. But who created the idea that climate denial is somehow equivalent to Holocaust denial? And that actually, surprisingly, came from Michael Crichton, the Jurassic Park guy, the Hollywood screenwriter. He gave a lecture at Caltech in 2003 entitled "Aliens Cause Global Warming." And it turns out, I think his motivation for giving this lecture, was his anger at Scientific American, which criticized Bjorn Lomborg very strongly in 4 articles, one written by Stephen Schneider for his book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. And so Scientific American really did go after Lomborg and criticize Lomborg. But if you look at the underline, I underlined it. The bottom part, he said it was a poor display featuring vicious ad hominem attacks, including comparing him to a Holocaust denier. you know, I doubt it. I had to go back and find it, and I actually found it in Stephen Schneider's archive at Stanford. So here's the passage. It was from a couple lines from Thomas Lovejoy, who wrote the fourth of the four columns, and he criticizes Lomborg. I wouldn't call that ad hominem. He's describing behavior mostly. Maybe the word pretends, that makes it sound like he may be intentionally misleading, but nevertheless, he says we go and we get a pattern of denial. So how Crichton made the leap from instead we get a pattern of denial to comparing him to a Holocaust denier is it is a little extreme in my opinion. So that gets a straw man. So I got this term from John Massey, and I'm not sure how he if he intended it to mean this, but I love the term meme laundering. And to me, it's a means by which a bogus idea is repeated and falsely attributed until it's uncritically accepted. And oftentimes, I think meme laundering, you know, I think politicians do it. You know, a White House senior official says something, and then the press reports it, and then it's reported, then it's attributed to the press, the New York Times or whoever quoted the anonymous source. I think that has happened. So I just went, these are just little postage stamps of kind of what I found out, the sequence of things, and they may or may not all be related, but Lovejoy in his Scientific American, he said pattern of denial. A year later, Crichton said Scientific American compared Lomborg to a Holocaust denier. Then there was something in De Smog comparing, saying industry-funded PR people were paid to deny climate change. Again, you know, not even using the word deny, you know, just basically saying they're saying climate change isn't true. That's what that word means. And then there were some anonymous comments. Climate deniers are the same as Holocaust deniers, some guy says the following summer. And then 2 days later, some other random anonymous commenter said, I deserve to be treated like a Holocaust denier. It seems a little suspicious that might be the same anonymous person trying to start something. And then only a few weeks later, Tim Ball says, denial is intended to invoke images of the Holocaust. And you kind of have to wonder about the connection there. And then 2 months later, Roger Pilkey Jr. says climate change denier is evocative of Holocaust denier. He may have come up with that completely independently of what Crichton came up with a few years earlier. But only 2 days after that, Mark Morano put out a press release in all caps: Nuremberg-style trials proposed for global warming skeptics. So I'm not sure how that leap got made, because Nuremberg trials were for the people who carried out the Holocaust, not for the people 40 years later who denied it. So, I ended up having to run out to the local bookstore to buy this book. This is Crichton's State of Fear, which I haven't read. I've only read the appendices and a few other parts, but it's basically some kind of thriller in which climate scientists are the bad guys. And if you look at the appendix, so there's actually a lot of stuff in the back, including an appendix, which you probably can't see in what I'm holding up, but I scanned it today. And he has a whole appendix on why politicized science is dangerous. So, you know, he starts off, imagine there's a new scientific theory that warns of impending crisis and points a way out. It quickly draws support, you know, and he goes on with this. Says, I don't mean global warming. I'm talking about another theory. So what is the other theory? Well, it turns out it's eugenics. And he goes on for pages about eugenics, comparing the 1920s, mid-20th century American eugenicists to modern climate scientists. American eugenicists had been jealous because Germans had taken leadership blah, blah, blah. And basically he gets explicitly into the Holocaust, comparing climate scientists and mainstream climate scientists who accept the consensus and work on climate science to Nazis who carried out the Holocaust. This is an explicit comparison. So I couldn't find in my virtual sticker sheet from John Cook, I couldn't find one that I don't know what this is. It is contradictory, and that's John's symbol for contradiction. So, you know, I would have to say Crichton is kind of holding two contradictory opinions. It's like he can accuse us of being like not just Holocaust deniers, but the people who carried out the Holocaust. But if we even use the word deny, somehow that's just astoundingly atrocious. So I would, John didn't have one called projection, but I think I would call that projection. So I have one more thing. So everything I've done so far is basically using John Cook's his taxonomy and methods used by climate deniers as my guide for criticizing Kunin's book. And that's something you don't have to be a scientist to do. You just have to go through and, anybody can Google like I did. Anybody can use that Google Books Ngram tool like I did. You don't have to have a PhD in physics to do that. You don't have to be an expert in climate science. You can go through and criticize stuff without actually addressing the technical details. But I did read the entire book cover to cover, and I did look at the technical details, and most of them were wrong or misunderstandings or misrepresentations. But I did find one point that he made that I thought was a valid point. And that is he in his figure 5.5, he talked about how there was a report which compared the frequency of record high temperatures to the frequency of record low temperatures. And the published graph in the climate report said that record high temperatures, the number of the frequency of records is increasing. But it's really the ratio of high to low that's increasing, according to his advisor, John Christie, who created this graph, which, as far as I know, hasn't been put through peer review. And so remember, John Christie was the guy that looked kind of like Ned Flanders in John Cook's cartoon. At least I think that's who John was drawing. So you can see from this graph that the frequency of high temperatures records is not increasing, but the frequency of low temperature records is decreasing, which is a signal, and it was a predicted fingerprint of climate change. So I sent this to several colleagues, and one of them, the only one who had also read through Kunin's book completely and in detail, had also identified this very same thing as a possible valid point. But one of the people on my list, Zeke Housefather, he said, well, I'll go through and I'll check that. And what he found was that he doesn't think Christie used homogenized data. Basically, it's a way to take out bad thermometers that get changed out. There are certain things you have to do. It's almost like a calibration method. And also, it didn't take into account the geographic distribution of the stations. You can't just average stations, because then you're not really averaging over area, you're averaging over points on the map. So I think this is going to get submitted through peer review. It's been getting passed around among my group of colleagues. And so, unfortunately, I don't have a sticker readily available to put on it. So I had to create my own sticker. And I'll close with my what I think should be a good sticker, because teachers have to put good stickers on good work, and so I'm going to do that. And there's my sticker. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
I got to say, I certainly appreciate that scientific skepticism sticker there. For those of you who may be visiting us from afar, that is in fact the Bay Area Skeptics logo. So that's pretty great. We do have some questions, but let me while Jay prepares them for us, let me just ask you something, because this whole question of settled science itself is pretty fascinating, I think. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. Can you, what's your understanding of the similarities and differences, if you will, between a consensus view and a settled view of science? Consensus science and settled view of science, which of course, the latter of which your friend Kunin uses.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't really think too many people use the term settled science. I mean, there are certain things that I think are settled. I mean, I think it's settled that the Earth goes around the sun, even though 25% of Americans don't know that or don't understand that. But I would like to think 100% of scientists know and accept that.
The Earth is spherical. You know.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a few keepers that we, but
yeah. The reality of biological evolution seems pretty settled, but there are a lot of people who don't believe it, and there are scientists who don't believe it, not specialists in evolutionary biology, but so.
I think the people who use the term settled science use it more as an epithet or a pejorative than anything else. It's
I mean, I think that's what
it's a synonym for dogmatism.
Yeah, exactly.
From that crew.
But I think, I mean, there are certain things that are settled, but when I think when Singer said everybody's, claiming that the science is settled, I mean, it's almost like he's claiming, well, they don't have anything else to do. They've proven everything, and let's move on to the next thing. And science is never like that. There's always more stuff to figure out. And every time you figure something out, well, you have a lot more questions. And so it's nothing's fully settled. You don't want it in a way. It would be really disappointing if all science was settled. We'd be out of jobs.
I don't think we have to worry about that a lot. I mean, with climate science, CO2 is a warming gas.
Yeah.
Okay. That is settled science.
Yeah. I mean, I would say
whether the oceans, and the example you used in your talk, whether the oceans are going to rise 3 feet or 6 feet or 9 feet is not, that is still something we're trying to figure out. But CO2 is a warming gas. That has been showed. So we can just take that as settled science if it were. But I agree with you. I used to be a scientist, but the scientists that I've dealt with for years and years, I don't think I've heard any of them say that. Use that phrase. I really think that's a phrase that comes from the deniers. Yeah,
and I did look, because when Singer said it, that's when it really started getting used by others, and it was attributed to the White House. And so okay, well, anything the White House says gets written down. And so I searched, and White House never said it. That was during the Clinton administration. Clinton did say something, something that was very strong. I have it somewhere because I did find it. But he didn't use the term "the science is settled."
Yeah.
Or I don't know if it was Clinton himself or one of his, White House staff who said it, but it was said by the White House.
Well, we may return to that because it is a pejorative, and it's something that the anti-science people who oppose science for whatever reason try to use it as a club. Jay has put a question up from Jay. Can you talk generally about the approach you use for criticism? I'm not sure whether Jay means the approach you use for that Mark uses to criticize others. Is that what you mean? You can stick that in chat if you want.
Well, I mean, I would say.
Just answer it any way you want.
I mean,
this is your privilege.
I'm sorry. So what I call the cranky uncle guide and the CSI guide, John Massey and Ray Hyman, respectively. In a way, they're very complementary. One is kind of like, here's the tool and here's how to use the tool, kind of. Although the how to use the tool came first. But I mean, I think together they work really well. If you follow Hyman's advice and use John Cook's. Yeah.
John, by the way, John Massey's is watching us. Hi, John.
Hi, John.
One is a delivery system. One is advice for how to deliver your criticism, and the other is more of a content I find them very nicely parallel. I agree.
And then I think also, my very first slide with the disclaimer, it's like, try to criticize behavior. Behavior is fair game, but, as soon as you start going after people and, accusing them of being liars or, motivations that they may or may not have, and unless you really have evidence, that's not a good place to go, especially if you're doing it as a scientist. If you're doing it outside the realm of science, then like if you're a lawyer or a business person, and that may be
different goals.
But as a scientist, I think it's criticizing behavior or methods. That's the appropriate thing. That's what you do if you are reviewing a paper.
Ray Howard has a question for you, Mark. He says, when you say Kunin is using tricks, are you suggesting he's being insincere in some way?
Well, as I said in my first slide, it's like, I'm going to give the facts, or my understanding and describe the behaviors and let others decide for themselves whether he's being insincere. I guess that's a dodge.
Radiation Bill, who is actually disguised as a Bay Area Skeptic board member, has the Mark, have you reviewed the book Apocalypse Never?
No, I haven't. I'd like to read it, but I'm going to wait until John Cook provides me with a sheet of stickers.
Look, just make your own damn stickers. John doesn't have to produce stickers for you. You can run them off yourself. Ray has another question for you, Mark. Renewables like wind and solar have been slow to take on the energy burden. What would you think of a resurgent for nuclear power?
Well, I mean, to the extent that nuclear power is, low carbon, it's not zero carbon because, it requires concrete and it requires a lot of other stuff, but it's definitely better than fossil fuels. I mean, we may need more of it. I'm way less afraid of, Chernobyl type event than I am of climate event. Like we've already had many climate disasters. I'll take nuclear over fossil fuel any day, but I would prefer wind and solar and other renewables.
Given druthers, you'd renewables over nuclear. Notice neither of us said nuclear. But I digress. Figure out what to do with the most dangerous radiation and then build the nuclear. Anyway, Jay Diamond has another question. Climate science to eugenics is a long stretch. Yeah. Is there a limit to how far deniers are willing to stretch, or is that irrelevant?
No, what Michael Crichton did, first creating the false notion that, Scientific American, one of the writers in Scientific American who used the word deny, and that somehow that was a reference to the Holocaust. And then a year later turned around and wrote an appendix in his book where he explicitly compared climate science to eugenics and further made the connection to the Holocaust. That's beyond the pale. I mean, that is, how can you, I don't know. I was not aware of that. And I made that connection as part of my review of Kunin's book, because it's like I want to drill down on this stuff and really see where this came from.
Well, actually, I was listening to that, to you talk about Crichton's book where he did make that comparison, and I was, because we're all compulsive readers and this kind of an outfit, and I was sort of skimming through the part. For starters, Crichton does not know very much about the history of eugenics, because quite frankly, as was explained by our Bay Area Skeptics speaker earlier this year, the Nazis got a lot of their ideas for the Holocaust and the treatment of other undesirables from American eugenicists. It wasn't the other way around, which is a kind of a icky thing to think about.
Well, I think actually I'd have to go look back and look at that appendix, but I think he did either outright say that or imply it, that it went both directions.
Yeah, it definitely
were inspired by it.
I shouldn't judge him by just a couple of paragraphs. Yeah. Well, we are out of time, and I would like to take this moment to thank you again for your presentation tonight and for joining us and for visiting with Bay Area Skeptics. Your talk was interesting. We got a lot out of it. We will post it on YouTube so that we can look at it again and get more ideas. I do appreciate you coming and spending time with us, Mark. Thanks very much.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Now, for the rest of you, hang on for just a moment, because I need to tell you about next month's presentation, which is going to be the much mentioned John Cook, who is a philosopher, a science communicator, a physicist. He wears a lot of hats. On the second Thursday of August, which is August 12th, John, as Mark mentioned, is founder of the website skepticalscience.com, which if you haven't seen, you should really check it out. It's got an incredible amount of information about how to reply to climate science deniers. He is the author of a number of skeptical publications and books, including Cranky Uncle, which was mentioned, but also something that skeptics should all have a copy of, and you can download it from skepticalscience.com, with Steve Lewandowski, the Debunking Handbook, which is an excellent source of the kind of information that Mark was talking about today. The title of John's talk next month is What to Do About Misinformation in 4 Dimensions. So that would be a fun thing for us to see. Thank you very much for joining Bay Area Skeptics. Please join us next month as well. Good night.